First of all, it's great to be here at Springfield with a group of people that share one of my great passions, and that's owning and shooting M1 rifles. This is a very special place to come, isn't it? It's almost like a pilgrimage in a way to have the opportunity to come here and interact with the history of this rifle. And what I wanted to do in this quick presentation is emphasize, I think, the more complicated and the lesser known periodization of the service history of the M1 rifle. Because the M1 that's made here, it's during the Second World War, during mass production, that really establishes the main body of historical knowledge that we have about the M1. This place that's still kind of haunted by it to this very day. But when we think of the service history of the M1 rifle, that is a service history that is mainly written on the battlefields of the Second World War. Of course, it serves beyond that, and I think it's entirely appropriate for us to think of places where the M1 served during the war. Early cases like here at Arzew in Algeria with, I think that was 4th Ranger Battalion. The rifle's early service in the Pacific, which included some gas trap rifles that are in combat in the Philippines and in New Guinea. Elsewhere in the Pacific, where you see here an African-American soldier from 93rd Infantry Division on the Numa Numa Trail, Bougainville in 1943. The rifle really makes its rounds. The rifle has a conspicuously well-known moment during the Normandy invasion, which is when this powerful photograph was taken, where you see a fallen American soldier, and next to him an .03 rifle and an M1. The M1 serves not just the amphibious landing forces that are a part of the Normandy invasion on Tuesday, June 6, 1944, but also paratroopers, and American paratroopers that descended under open parachute canopies and sometimes rode into town on a white horse, like a cowboy movie. The M1 rifle crosses the Rhine River. The M1 rifle, and with men of the 89th Division in this case, the rifle famously summits Mount Suribachi during the landings and the battle for Iwo Jima. And the rifle eventually even crosses into one city in Germany after the other. And here you're seeing German children looking down on an American rifleman with his M1. And you had to clean your M1, and sometimes when you're on Okinawa, the best thing available for cleaning is a Japanese prayer flag. Fascinating photograph, isn't it? We're really familiar, too, with how the M1 soldiers on beyond the Second World War, and we know that it's the standard service rifle during the conflict in Korea. The rifle serves in the Korean War, and I believe that the two conflicts together constitute our primary knowledge, what we think of primarily when we think of the service history of the M1 rifle. Now, I don't believe I'm saying anything new or revealing any detail to any of you that you aren't already aware of, and that is that the M1 continues to serve beyond 1953. That's no big revelation, that's nothing new. But the M1 does, as it serves on beyond 1953, it does some very interesting things. It writes these additional chapters of history, and in some cases, they're a little bit surprising. In some cases, they're a little on the dark side. And that's what I wanted to talk about in this presentation, because it brings what I believe, the presentation I hope to challenge what you think of in terms of the way that you think of the periodization of this rifle as a service weapon. There are other users of the M1 rifle. That's another topic I'm going to touch on here. And in this case, you're seeing members of the Kaknu Battalion of the Ethiopian Army that serves in Korea here, some with the M1 carbine and some with the M1 rifle itself. The M1 rifle actually has an interesting domestic service history insofar as on September 19th, 1957, paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division armed with M1 rifles are involved in the desegregation of Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. It's not the only moment when the M1 etches itself into the social and cultural history of the United States of America, but more on that later. Back to the other users. In this case, in 1961, Dutch soldiers, and one of them armed with the M1. So the M1, and again, not a big revelation, particularly to the knowledgeable individuals in this audience, but the M1 serves other countries than the United States, and in this case, serving the Netherlands. The M1 famously serves the Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnamese forces, during that conflict. And this is, I think, from about 1964, where you see people hefting around 9.5 pounds of infantry rifle. In this case, you're seeing M1s in the service of the Honduran Army during, what was it called, Operation Power Pack, and that was the military intervention of the Dominican Republic in 1965. Honduran troops there with the M1. And then another notorious domestic incident unfolds on May 4th, 1970. I'm sure that some people remember this incident very, very well, and that is when the Ohio National Guard, in 13 seconds, fires 67 rounds from M1 rifles, killing 4 and wounding 9 in one of the darker moments of the history of the M1 service rifle, producing this now very well-known photograph. The Ohio National Guard, as a result of this incident, very quickly moves away from using rifles like the M1 for crowd control, and they quickly adopt the Remington Model 870 Wingmaster 12-gauge shotgun, specifically for that role. Now we'll jump over to Monrovia, Liberia in April of 1980, where a coup d'etat against the government of William Talbert. William Talbert's government was overthrown in a coup d'etat, and Talbert himself, in addition to all of the members of his cabinet, were taken down to a beach in Monrovia at a place called the Barclay Training Area, where they were all executed with American-made M1 rifles. So the M1 rifle, it writes itself into the history of the African continent as well. But now, let's talk about one of the more famous of the other users. The Italians make extensive use of the M1 rifle, and the Italians put their own spin on it in an interesting way. In this case, you're seeing Italians in the late 50s, early 60s with the M1 rifle. The Italians will then take the obvious next step, a step that the United States government takes too, and that is transitioning the rifle from 30 caliber to the 7.62 by 51 millimeter cartridge, and a rifle that they call the Garand Tipo 2, the Type 2 M1 rifle. It serves as a predecessor to what will eventually come after that, and that is the adaptation in 1959 of the M1, not just to 7.62 by 51, but also magazine feed, which will eventually result in the creation of the BM59 series rifles. But I'm going to go into that in a little bit more detail in just a moment when we get to South America. But for now, let's talk about emulation. It's the highest form of flattery, and there are copycats, and I wanted to mention 2 of them because I think they're certainly noteworthy. And in this case, you're seeing a rifle that, depending on who you talk to, is sometimes referred to as the Type 4, sometimes referred to as the Type 5. I typically argue that it's not proper to use either one because it was never an officially adopted rifle in the Japanese military. And in case you're not familiar with it, and you're seeing it maybe for the first time, the Type 4/Type 5 rifle was created at the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal during the Second World War, and it was simply a reverse-engineered M1 rifle. The Japanese had captured quantities of the M1 rifle in combat in the Philippines in 1942, and the Japanese recognized just what a force multiplier a semi-automatic shoulder arm was, and the Japanese sought to duplicate that. They had, in the years prior to World War II, sought to adopt a semi-automatic service rifle. They experimented with Czech designs and also an American design. But then as World War II begins to unfold, and they are finding that their troops are at the disadvantage of a manual operation when they confront American troops on the battlefield, the Japanese eventually produce this, of course, chambered for the 7.7 by 58 millimeter cartridge. They had to do away with the in-block clip. At first, the Japanese simply tried to modify captured M1s in 30 caliber to accept the 7.7 by 58 millimeter cartridge, and they were unsuccessful in making that work. And that was, interestingly, where they failed was not in rechambering the rifle and making it run. They could not get the 8-round in-block clip to work with the 7.7 millimeter cartridge. They brought Type 4/Type 5s here to Springfield because that was a firearm that ultimately is added to the engineering library that is the Springfield Armory. But the rifle, it exists in small numbers here in the United States today. Because it was produced in very small numbers by the Japanese, there's still disagreement about the total number produced, but the number is generally agreed at being somewhere in the neighborhood of 125 examples. So it is quite rare. And there is at least testimony in one case of a Type 4/Type 5 rifle being used in combat on Okinawa. Very interesting development. So if you're at a gun show and you ever see a funny looking M1, look closer. It might be a Japanese copy. But speaking of copies, there's then this one that I got to spend some time with in Argentina. Argentina sought to adopt a new service rifle in the year 1953, and that's because prior to 1953, Argentina was using the Mauser-designed rifle. In Berlin, they had ordered a specific version called the 1909 Mauser that served the Argentine military all the way up until the 1950s. And by 1953, you're really a little bit behind the times with a 5-shot manually operated bolt-action rifle as your service rifle. And so Argentina wanted to adopt something new. They actually requested, and I got to see the letter where they requested it in Buenos Aires. There's a great museum. If you ever get a chance, has anyone ever been to the Museo de Armas de la Nación at Circulo Militar in Buenos Aires? If you ever find yourself in Buenos Aires as anyone interested in the history of small arms, you would love this museum. It's one of the most incredible collections of small arms I've ever seen, and it was the late President Juan Perón's personal firearms collection, and he was a big-time shooter. At any rate, they got curious about the American-made M1 rifle in those years that followed the Second World War. There was plenty of evidence to support that the M1 was a big success, and the result was that Juan Perón in 1952 wrote a letter to the U.S. ambassador to Argentina asking if he might obtain an example of this American rifle called the M1. And attempting to keep diplomatic ties strong and alive, the United States government sent him one. And the one that we sent him, he then turned around and gave it to, if anyone knows Argentine small arms, he gave it to the factory called Domingo Mathieu in Santa Fe, or it's in the province of Santa Fe, upriver from Buenos Aires. You've probably seen it at gun shows. They usually have the initials DGFM, FMAP, Dirección General de Fabricaciones Militares. Well, Juan Perón asked for one. We gave them one, or gave it to him. He then turned around and gave it to the factory, the Domingo Mathieu factory in Rosario, and asked them to produce a copy, which they did. They reverse engineered the M1 rifle. And you're seeing a few examples of it. I had the opportunity to spend a little time with the rifle. And these are the other two rifles that they considered briefly. So during this brief shining moment, the Argentine military was like, we can either go with the American M1, the American Johnson rifle, or the MP44. Sort of a strange group, isn't it? And the interesting thing is that in each case, the 3 firearms were all reverse engineered by hand at 3 different state-owned industrial interests in Argentina. But then all of it got kind of flushed down the toilet. It was all for naught because in 1955, Argentina adopted the Belgian FAL, and that put it all to rest once and for all. But there was this kind of cool moment when Argentina was thinking about putting the MP44 into production, or the M1 rifle, or the Johnson rifle. And to go to the museum today, you'll find the Garand copy. It is in this display case, and it's on this little side wall. You see how it's kind of awkwardly positioned on the side wall to where you cannot begin to get a good close look at it. But it's right there next to something else that is of interest. And the rifle that's just there next to it is simply a BM-59E. Which is the Italian, the third modification of the M1 rifle by the Italians. And I'm mentioning that for a very specific point. And that point is that Argentina ends up with, even after they decided not to adopt the American M1 rifle, they eventually adopt the FAL instead. But then, even though they weren't really wanting it, they ended up with a large quantity of M1 rifles. And that's because of the Brooklyn-class light cruiser USS Phoenix. And USS Phoenix was formerly in the United States Navy, and it was a ship in port on Sunday, December 7th, 1941 in Pearl Harbor. It escapes the December 7th attack with no damage, and it serves on in the United States military until then, ultimately, it was sold to the Argentine government, where it was christened ARA Admiral Belgrano. And does anybody know what happened next? It's the one and only warship torpedoed by a nuclear submarine in the history of modern warfare. But the big part of the story is that the same ship, when it was purchased and it went south to Buenos Aires, well, it really went south to the Mar del Plata naval base. And when it arrived, as a part of the deal, this package deal, whereby we sold the ship, we sold this ship and we sold some submarines to the Argentine government. And the ship was packed full of M1 rifles, 1911 pistols, M1 carbines, 1897 shotguns, and then a very, very large consignment of ammunition for all of the above. So Argentina, even though they had considered the M1 and decided to go in a different direction, they end up with this large consignment of M1 rifles, over 30,000 rifles. And they had plenty of 30 caliber, a couple of million rounds, but by the late 1960s, they had burned through all the 30 caliber that came as a part of the package deal. They still had these M1 rifles. It's not the caliber that the Argentine government's using, because by then the Argentine government was converting over to the 7.62 by 51 millimeter cartridge. They still had some old bolt-action rifles around in, 7.65 by 53 Argentine, sometimes called Belgian, whatever. They still had those rifles, and then they still had those weapons in service, and then they have 30,000 American-made M1s in a caliber that they don't have. And the alternative that they considered briefly was putting the 30 caliber cartridge into production at a factory called Fray Louis Beltran. And if you ever see Argentine ammunition, it's typically head stamped FLB. It's this, basically their small arms factory. And rather than do that, what Argentina ultimately decided to do was to take the M1s, turn them over to Beretta for conversion to the BM-59E. And what that means then is that you had American 30 caliber M1 rifles that were then converted by the Italians for the Argentine government. And there's a great example in the museum in Buenos Aires, this particular one, having served the Argentine Navy briefly in the 1982 conflict. I'm fascinated with the BM-59E because, first of all, I have one and I really like it a lot. But then secondly, you really just have to respect the Italian ingenuity that went into this, developing a proprietary magazine, evaluating the rifle, figuring out how to modify it to 7.62, and then figuring out how to make it select fire. So you have not just a selector switch, you also have this muzzle device that works miracles in terms of controlling felt recoil and muzzle rise. Also have a rubber butt pad on the rifle, and it's a successfully executed conversion to select fire 7.62. There you see that would be the auto sear, I guess, poking through. It's in the semi-auto position, so it's retracted downward. But nevertheless, an interesting rifle. And when the Italians converted them, they had to do something about the American heel stampings and markings on each firearm. So you can see what they did, and isn't it fascinating? The way that they had struck through where it says Cal 30, and then up on above the heel they put in 7.62 millimeter Pietro Beretta. In this case, this is part of the Argentine conversions from 1967. But this started off life as an American 30 caliber M1 rifle, and this one, the example in the museum in Buenos Aires, it was born here on this campus that would be for 5,347,000. When would that be? Yeah, it's 54, yeah, getting close to the end of production there. So it starts off life here as a 30 caliber semi-auto 8-shot, and it ends up in Argentina as a 20 round capacity select fire. Kind of an interesting story. But this is where it really gets good, because Argentina then took them to the Falkland Islands when they invaded. at the beginning of April of 1982. And in case you're not remembering that war, that was this 72-day-long conflict during which Argentina occupied the islands, only to then be later ejected. And in this interesting series of photos that's showing Argentine naval commandos at the airfield near the city of Stanley, right after a bombing raid. If you're into the Falklands War, you know that Vulcan bombers flew down from Wide Awake Airfield on Ascension Island, bombed the airfield, and these men are actually posing in craters that were created by the first of those bombing raids, May 1st, 1982. And you can see one man closer to the foreground with his FAL model 50.00, and then the man behind him with his hand near the muzzle, that is one of these BM-59E conversions. And if you subscribe, if you're a member and you received the journal, you've seen this. We did a feature on that photograph at one point. There are a few other photos from the 1982 war showing Argentine troops in the Falkland Islands. They're all naval troops, by the way. And they're posing with their formerly M1 30 caliber rifles, now BM-59E conversions. And I like this just because it shows you that in this moment, which is when conventional warfare meets the missile age, John Garand is also there and a part of the conflict, and that kind of fascinates me. Now, the M1 continues to live on for ceremonial purposes all over the world, literally all over the world. In this case, you're seeing men that are posing at the memorial to the unknown soldier in Athens, armed with their M1 rifles. It's an interesting surprise that not just the Greeks are using the M1 for this sort of thing today. You see it elsewhere, particularly in, that was all the way back in 2006. It was one of those at the right place at the right time with the right camera on me moments, and that is that I, one afternoon, went up to the Martyr Shrine in Taipei, Taiwan, where I was able to capture these photographs. And if you remember these are from a journal from, over 10 years ago, of Taiwanese Air Force junior enlisted reporting during the changing the guard at the Martyr Shrine. And you can see them looking really sharp with their chromed M1 rifles with dark black stocks. They probably didn't quite understand why I was interested in taking so many photographs. But they were stoic the whole time. And the great thing is when they post the guard at the shrine, they have this fantastic changing of the guard ceremony. When they post, they stand on these little pedestals, and it makes it possible for you to get really close and get some great photos of heel marks. I don't think I have it here, but this one's, that's a Springfield, isn't it? Yeah. The other one, there's a man standing on the other side of the entrance to the shrine, and it was interesting that day he had an international harvester. But that's not the strangest case, not the strangest example of the M1 rifle living on in ceremonial service. I think that definitely the strangest example belongs to the Japanese. You don't often see it, but periodically for formal occasions, the Japanese will fall out with an honor guard, and that honor guard is armed with the M1. The ironies there of an M1 rifle under the rising sun just fill me with meditation and reflection. One great thing, every year I lead these battlefield tours all over the world, and every year I do a big Pacific tour in the month of March, because the month of March is the only time that the Japanese let us go to the island of Iwo Jima. They allow us onto the island one day per year, and we send up an honor guard and a band, they send up a band and an honor guard, and you can bet your bottom dollar that honor guard is not armed with the M1 rifle, because I think they're aware that if they had an honor guard with M1s on Iwo Jima, it might not have the best optics. Instead, what they show up with for the annual ceremony is the Type 89 rifle, the Howa Select Fire 5.56 millimeter rifle. Let me get back to you on that, because I'm going to Iwo Jima here in just a few months, and maybe it'll change. It's the 75th anniversary, and wouldn't it just be the strangest thing you've ever seen on the 75th anniversary of the Battle of Iwo Jima to see Japanese honor guard with M1s? I doubt that's going to happen. But the M1 also lives on today in the American military, challenging yet again this idea that this is a former rifle. This is a rifle that's very much in the present tense, and I believe that all of these Coast Guardsmen would testify to every ounce of that 9.5 pounds, because don't they look like they're having the best day ever in the pouring rain doing drill with their M1s? So this generation of people, and I think it's safe to conclude that the people depicted in these photographs were born after the year 1990. So these young Americans, an entirely new generation of Americans serving in the uniformed service of the American military and training with the M1. My father did basic training with an M1 rifle in 1959, and she is in basic training with an M1 in 2019. Isn't that fascinating? Going back to the present tense, this is where this story, I think, gets especially interesting. During the era of the Syrian Civil War, this war was full of surprises, to include the occasional appearance of M1 rifles. Like with this guy, I call this NC Starman, because look, what is this scope that he has somehow managed to get mounted on his M1? But you do, in a few occasions during the Syrian Civil War, see examples of surplus 30 caliber M1 rifles that make it out into the streets. They show up in some cases where they're not actively in combat, but then, like in this photograph, the M1 rifle still putting rounds downrange in combat in, of all places, Syria. The M1 rifle, it's made its appearance in both Iraq and Afghanistan. We're still debating about whether this photo was Iraq or Afghanistan. There's a strong case to be made for Afghanistan, and in fact, it probably is Afghanistan, but there are discrepancies in the reports of the photo. Maybe you've seen this photo before. It is sort of omnipresent on the internet these days. But here you have an M1 rifle that was discovered by an American soldier during the global war on terror in the 21st century, proving yet again that the M1 does not belong to the past. It belongs to the present. And like I already mentioned, the ongoing agony in Yemen to this day occasionally includes the M1 rifle, in this case a Houthi rebel armed with an M1 who posed for a photograph in 2016. We're getting a time continuum that's creeping very, very close to the present, aren't we? And yet the M1 rifle is still there and still going strong. Now, since I'm speaking of that part of the world and M1 rifles, let me just shift for a moment to Anniston, Alabama. I would be more correct to call it Oxford, Alabama, but whatever. This rifle came back to the civilian marksmanship program in 2016, I think it was. And it was recovered on the battlefield by U.S. troops in Afghanistan. And it provides some interesting things, not the least of which is that it's an international harvester M1. And the things that shipped back with the rifle, here you can see some keen-eyed person labels it M1 carbine, caliber 30 M1. A little mistake that I guess can be made here in the modern era, people that are less familiar with it. Not everyone is a member of the GCA, I guess. But I have taken to calling this the Sand Garand because when you get close to it, it's still gritty and nasty. It hasn't been cleaned up, and I hope they never clean it up because that is such a critical part of this rifle story. I've often given to saying this very droll and banal comment of, oh, if only it could talk. If only this rifle could talk, I wonder how the heck it ended up where it did. Now, the troops that turned it over and sent it back to Anniston, they have a little bit of a narrative of how it got there that's spelled out with some documents that came with the rifle. Look at the sand on this thing. Full of sand to this day. Now, so it comes back with this, and then it came back with this little card where it's kind of structuring this straw man of possibilities of how the rifle might have made its way into the combat environment of Afghanistan. In other words, captured by the Taliban from the Iranians. And we do know for a fact that under the era of the military assistance program that M1 rifles in large numbers were sent to Iran prior to the 1979 Islamic Revolution. And I think, weren't most of them international harvesters anyway? I think they were. And this one's an international harvester. And there I find one of the most thought-provoking of the other users of the M1, and that is Iran. So prior to the Shah's abdication, prior to the 1979 Islamic Revolution, the M1 rifle was arming the Iranian military and training it. And then when the revolution began, those old American-made 30 caliber M1 rifles are brought out, and they show up in the streets. You see there's one off to the far right side of the frame, right there alongside G3 rifles during the revolution in '79. Here, you're seeing a cleric training troops with their American-made M1 rifles, and I hope they were all fully aware of the deep ironies of them sitting there listening to a cleric. And then, of course, the M1 rifle is used by the Iranians in the Iran-Iraq War. So, you've got M1 rifles that aren't just fighting World War II and Korea and Vietnam, but also fighting the wars of decolonization and instability in Africa, as well as fighting wars in the troubled Middle East in the 1980s, which I think is a fascinating aspect of the rifle's history. Now, back to CMP real quick. We were aware that the CMP was about to receive a consignment of 86,000 M1 rifles from the Philippines, and they came up earlier in Mark Johnson's comments, which I thought was very interesting, because Mark really kind of set up what I'm about to do nicely in commenting about those rifles. Because Mark, you might recall, he said that they're ugly and they're dirty, although they're the cleanest M1s ever because they're free of termites and asbestos. But nevertheless, as they were about to come into the country, we were on alert, and we descended on Anniston to cover the opening of the boxes that came in. There was a question about cans and M1s earlier coming back from the Philippines. None of the ones I saw came in cans. The ones I saw that day, they all came like this in these white cardboard pallets. And so we traveled to Anniston, and we documented the opening of not all, but many of the pallets that came in from the Philippines. And when we popped those pallets open, the things we found inside were spectacular. If you haven't seen the documentary short video that we made about this, check it out on YouTube. Maybe you saw what I wrote about it in the journal, and if not, let me just walk you through some of the surprises that were waiting for us in these pallets. So there you see Rodney there about to pop it open. And when we pop them open, we got the weirdest combination of rifles in unbelievably perfect condition, and then rifles in the absolute worst possible condition you could imagine. So that we saw, even within one box, you got this eclectic mixture of beautiful as-built M1s and the most wretched things you've ever seen. I thought I'd just walk you through a couple of them real quick. Let's just get to this one. We popped this one out. And of course you can see just absolutely slathered in cosmoline. And we wiped away enough cosmoline just to realize that this is an as-built gun. That gun is, I think, in the condition that it left the factory, and it went all the way to the Philippines, stayed in that condition, probably never got unpacked and degreased, and then made its way all the way back to Alabama. An incredible find. Look at that thing. We wiped away just enough to see the serial number. But that rifle left this factory. I can't see the number right now. That rifle left this campus and followed a long journey all the way to the Republic of the Philippines and then all the way back again. So there's an example of good news when we pulled rifles out of pallets. Now let's get on to the bad news, because the bad news is quite bad. We got some really funky, interesting rifles that we popped out of pallets. Like there you see that. That one immediately arrested my attention because I'm like, somebody went to work with the hand drill for reasons that I guess might be heat dissipation or maybe to make it lighter. I don't really know, and I can't speak for the person who did this. I can only speculate. Nevertheless, there's the rifle. I pulled it out, and this is why I'm going on to this subject, and I wanted to show you a few examples of the ugly ones. And that's because on the day that we did this, which was last April, we pulled out these really awful condition rifles that had weird things like pieces of rope tied to them. They had red painted on the stocks. They're missing parts. Many of them were, I should say maybe most of them were unserviceable and probably not even recoverable. And we were at first confused about why that would be the case. To the casual observer, your first conclusion might be that the Philippines weren't taking care of these old military assistance program rifles. And as it turns out in the end, that's not the case. We didn't know that the day that we were there, but then subsequent research would eventually explain all of this. But before that explanation, let me just show you a couple of more bad ones. How you like the muzzle on this one? Well, I don't know what the gauge would be on that. That's got to be 4+ for muzzle. This guy, I can't figure this out unless it was someone who was trying to make kind of step out with a bold appearance, something fast and fashionable. And so he drilled 72 holes in his forward handguard. Rifles in rough shape, you'd see every now and then these pieces of fabric on them from where they were where they used, I think, machine gun belts to fashion patrol slings. Then otherwise, overall rusty condition, parts missing. Here's one that was hurting a little bit. You can notice that around, he had a little problem there with the barrel. At some point, you just don't need rear sights anymore, so you just go with what you got. But that rifle left this factory and made it all the way to the Philippines, where it wasn't very well cared for. And I now have a pretty good explanation of why you would see this. But let's do 2 more. I loved this one just because you see the way somebody scalloped the wood, which I thought, why didn't Springfield think of that? Look how great that looks. And then they put that there. We kept seeing, you see how there's blue around the serial numbers? We believe that there was that they were using a chemical to try to degrease them that left this blue film on them. But here's my favorite one of the day. And I asked Mark Johnson if I could buy it, and the answer was no. But this one, when I pulled it out, my first thought was, oh wow, it's got an M14E2 stock on it, but that's not what this is. It's an M1 stock. You can see that they drilled a hole through it so they could use a rope as a sling. You see the stickers on it? Some friends of mine in the Philippines ultimately filled me in on what that is, and it was from chewing gum. You'd get these little circular plastic containers of chewing gum, and they would come with stickers that included Disney characters, Huey, Dewey, and Louie. So I picked it out, I photographed it, and I was just in love with this thing. And then I grabbed it up and went to shoulder it. And as I tried to shoulder it, with my hand on that little rough-hewn pistol grip, my hand ended up coming to about right there before the buttstock contacted my shoulder. So it had this extraordinarily short length of pull. And that's when I realized, oh, this is a gun for a child soldier. This is a gun that's been specifically modified so that someone very young and small in stature could use it. And here's where the story gets interesting. We know that the Philippine military had M1s, and that was nothing new. We knew that they would train with them because periodically we'd see photos like this famous series of photographs that was taken of, I think they were naval cadets that were breaking their rifles out and cleaning them up for use during one of the Philippine academies. This was not a surprise to us. What surprised us was to see so many of them in such abominable condition. And now we know why, because it wasn't the Philippine military doing it. They take very good care of their guns. That's a shooting culture that they know what they're doing. They don't neglect firearms. But I'll tell you who does. Well, people living out in remote areas. The Philippine government, going back to the 1960s, had to have these provincial reconnaissance units that were trying to stamp out former Marxist rebels. And there was a Marxist rebel force that was operating particularly on the island of Mindanao and the Sulu archipelago in the southern part of the Philippines, dating back to the 1960s. I mean, really, it dates back to the 1940s, actually. And these would-be Marxists eventually, through an ongoing terror campaign that goes on for decades, they eventually articulate a name that you've probably heard before, and that name is Abu Sayyaf. And Abu Sayyaf militants were, I'm using past tense, and I think it's safe to do it now, but for a very long time, Abu Sayyaf militants were a problem for the Philippine government in terms of maintaining law and order in areas that were remote to begin with and therefore difficult to maintain law and order. Well, The Philippine government formed these units, these provincial reconnaissance units, that they could position in remote places like the islands of the Sulu archipelago, remote areas in central Mindanao, places that it was difficult for the military to get to. These local people knew that area, and they were used during those opening decades to fight off the Abu Sayyaf, when Abu Sayyaf was mainly just a Marxist force. But then Abu Sayyaf undergoes a change during the era that predates the global war on terror. And Abu Sayyaf embraces Islam and then becomes a leading source of instability in the Philippines with an objective of establishing a Muslim caliphate. They changed their name briefly to what I call the most unfortunate of all acronyms. They changed their name to the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. And if you acronym that, you'll see what I mean by unfortunate. It doesn't really instill terror against your enemies when you say, I'm here on behalf of MILF. But the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, also known as Abu Sayyaf, begins this campaign of terrorism that dates back to the mid-1980s, and it continues into the 90s, and it continues into the 21st century. And then it was a low-scale problem. It wasn't a major problem for the Philippine government, but it was a problem that was lingering and wouldn't go away. That low-scale problem, I should say small-scale problem, became a major problem on May 23rd, 2017. Because it was on that date that Abu Sayyaf began a campaign in the city of Marawi on Mindanao. And during the Battle of Marawi that follows, the Philippine Army fights these former members of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, Abu Sayyaf, who were then now sympathetic to and aligned with the Islamic State. So in other words, ISIS begins fighting in the Philippines. And the way that ISIS attempted to fight in the Philippines, I shouldn't say attempt, I just gave away the ending, but you probably already know how this story ends anyway. Nevertheless, the way that ISIS attempted to insinuate itself into the history of the modern Philippines was with the bold objective of establishing a caliphate stronghold in the city of Marawi, Mindanao. And Mindanao is heavily Muslim. Not everyone is an ISIS fighter. It's a lot of very peace-loving and peaceful people who are also Muslim. But then people from remote areas came in, and they sought to, by capturing this city, make a bold statement on an international stage about the strength of the Islamic State. Well, what follows then is a battle stretching for 153 days from May all the way through October of 2017. And during that time, you saw the Islamic State flag. You saw militants waving it proudly as they held on to a city, the one and only time outside of the Levant where the Islamic State captures a city and attempts to hold on to it. And when I say attempt, they had to face the facts eventually, because perhaps you've heard of this man, Rodrigo Duterte, the president of the Philippines. He's not exactly one to mince words, and he's not exactly one to dance delicately around things like this. And Duterte committed his government to overpowering the Islamic State, Abu Sayyaf militants that took over Marawi. And over the course of this 153-day-long battle, he ultimately defeats them, and defeats them by basically bringing down destruction. And during that battle, at one point, a cameraman filmed an ISIS team engaged in sniper activity against the Philippine Army, armed with the M1 rifle. That's where all those dirty and nasty guns were coming from that made their way back to Anniston, Alabama. And I'll tell you how they got there. Well, this is at a high point during the Battle of Marawi City. The battle rages on. The city is ultimately transformed into a ruin as a result of the 153 days of fighting. But at the end of that 153 days, President Duterte declared the city of Marawi free of the terrorist influence. Those were his exact words. And that should have spelled the absolute end of Abu Sayyaf and the Islamic State in the Philippines. But it didn't really, because there's a final chapter that follows this. And what follows this is that in the aftermath of the Battle of Marawi, as much as we like to understand and comprehend Rodrigo Duterte as being a strong man, we use the word strong man almost condescendingly when we refer to somebody in a country other than our own that engages in aggressive and bold behaviors. But he could also be a little bit smart, and he was also a little bit of a deal maker. And after the uprising in Marawi, after the destruction of the Caliphate stronghold, Duterte put out a call to anyone else out there who was still aligned with the Islamic State, who might still potentially wish to fight the Philippine government. He offered them an amnesty, and the amnesty was, if you come in and surrender, and if you turn in weapons, you won't go to prison, you won't be maltreated, you won't be treated as a prisoner, and the government will provide you some assistance. And it was an extremely effective way of getting what was left of Abu Sayyaf, particularly in the Sulu Archipelago, remote islands in the Sulu Sea. It was very effective at getting them to come down out of the hills, something that had been going on. They'd been up in those hills for decades, and Duterte, using this system of offering incentives, actually marked a great deal of success, because after the fall of Marawi, so Marawi falls in October 2017. In early 2018, these surrenders are happening, and they're fascinating because they're well documented. And also, basically, in every surrender on every island, you see M1 rifles. You see other weapons as well, making the subject all the more interesting, but nevertheless, it's fascinating to see that in the year 2018, you still have members of Abu Sayyaf coming down out of the hills to surrender to the Joint Philippine Army Task Force, turn in their weapons and ammunition, and every single weapons cache includes John Garand's masterpiece. This is a weapon that does not belong to the past, because this weapon is still very much a part of the present day. Interestingly, as they brought them in, you had these small-scale surrenders that were on remote islands. And if anybody knows the Sulu Sea, there are literally hundreds upon hundreds of small islands, making uncountable the number of places where Abu Sayyaf Islamic State militants could be hidden. And the Philippine military then spent several months visiting these places, accepting the surrender of these people, and disarming them, and then providing the aid that basically stabilized the situation after the incredible moment of instability that was defined by the Battle of Marawi City for 153 days. And you see small-scale surrenders, but then there were also a few staged, large-scale, basically publicity events that were associated with this era of surrenders and amnesties. And here's one that's, look at these guys. I love this. These two guys came out of the jungle with their M1s, posing for a photo as they handed over a symbolic photo. They're not hauled off to prison. They're not executed. Look at them. Don't they look fun? Serious business there, especially with the M79. But over and over again, you have well-documented small-scale surrenders. But then there are two massive, large-scale surrender ceremonies. And I say ceremonies, Abu Sayyaf isn't a part of it, but it's basically a presentation for publicity purposes during which the weapons that were surrendered by Abu Sayyaf Islamic State militants were put on public display for the media. One that's particularly well known, you're seeing some shots here, where Maria Isabel Kamiko, who was the mayor, you see her there on the far right, the mayor of Zamboanga City. They staged this event with her and General Rodriguez of the Philippine Army, where everybody comes and poses over the tables, and then the mayor walked up and down the tables and looking at them. And if you look at the M1s on that table, doesn't that look a lot like those M1s that we were popping open in the crates in Anniston, Alabama, just about a little over a year ago? That's where those guns were coming from. So if you end up buying one of the rifles that Mark Johnson was describing earlier, you might very well get an M1 that was used by the Islamic State in the Philippines. Now, granted, a lot of those guns were in rough shape and might not be salvageable, but some of them might be. And wouldn't that be an interesting thing to find waiting on your doorstep in a CMP-shaped box one day? The next big one was in March of 2018. So I'm talking about events that were just barely over a year ago. And it was one that was attended by the president himself, March 26th, at a place called Petikul on the island of Jolo, where they brought the media in. The president said a few words. The president flew down from Manila, said a few words, and then he did a brief tour walking up and down the aisles of all the captured weapons, where you're seeing 81 millimeter mortars, 60 millimeter mortars, 50 caliber machine guns, 30 caliber machine guns, M14s, M16s, and then one pile of M1 rifles after another. To include this pile here, this photo I find especially interesting because what they have done is they have organized the M1s on this long table by the island from which they were surrendered. In this case, you're seeing closest to us the island of Tongkil, which is not terribly far from Jolo in the Sulu Sea. And so what happened is the Philippine military went to the island of Tongkil, and after having advertised this amnesty campaign, they accepted the surrender of Abu Sayyaf Islamic State militants. They took their rifles, and then they ended up on display here. And that is why the rifles sitting in the warehouse at CMP South look so rough, because those rifles were probably captured by the Moro Islamic Liberation Front during fighting in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Those rifles then remained hidden, are secreted in jungle caches in the Sulu, on islands in the Sulu Sea for decades, which is why they rusted, which is why they suffered so much abuse. And at which point they were then issued to a future generation of Islamic State warriors, in some cases children who needed smaller buttstocks. And so this is why I like to challenge our standard periodization of comprehending the history of the M1 rifle. I'm right there with the next guy in that when I think of the M1, I tend to think about troops dragging them uphill and down valley through the snows of Northern Europe, or people like my grandfather landing on islands in the Pacific carrying the M1 over the beach. I tend to think about that, but for every example of an M1 being used in the Second World War, I think we should also pause to remember that the M1 is still out there today, because I don't know that it's safe to proclaim that the Islamic State and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front and Abu Sayyaf are completely done in the Republic of the Philippines. I think there are probably some holdouts out there still, and I bet you those holdouts still have M1 rifles. And I sometimes lament the fact that the big man's no longer with us. I know that it's ridiculous to think that he might still be with us today, but my life overlapped with his 4 or 5 years. And whenever I go and whenever I think about him, we went to his grave yesterday, and standing there, it becomes a meditation with all of this history. And I wonder what he would say. I wonder if he ever imagined that his rifle would be distributed to the far corners of the world. I wonder if he ever imagined his rifle would be used in combat by the Republic of Argentina. I'm sure he couldn't possibly imagine a world where there is an Islamic State. And so he would definitely be surprised by the fact that the Islamic State used his masterpiece in a way that he would never have intended, and I don't think he would be okay with it. But you know what? When you design the world's finest rifle, that's what happens. Thanks, everybody.